The light that came first was not light at all, but a suggestion of it, a dilution of the blackness in the east, turning the distant, saw-toothed peaks from obsidian to charcoal. The air in the valley was still and cold, heavy with the scent of pine resin and damp earth, a blanket woven by the night. Then came the sound, a single, high, lonesome cry that cut through the silence and seemed to hang in the air long after it was gone. A coyote, greeting the dawn or mourning the dark. It was the same sound that had echoed through these canyons for 1,000 years, a stark reminder that each new day was not a gift, but a prize won from the night. Slowly, the charcoal of the mountains bled into a deep violet, and the first true light spilled over the ridges, a pale, liquid gold that flowed down the slopes and pooled in the grassy basin. It touched the frost on the sagebrush, turning each leaf into a sliver of silver. It warmed the granite faces of the cliffs, chasing the deep shadows from their cracks and hollows. This was the world as Ron Hale knew it, a world of harsh lines and soft light, of profound silence and sudden, sharp sounds. He moved with the quiet economy of a man who spends most of his time alone. His hands, calloused and brown, worked the leather of the cinch strap with a familiar rhythm, tightening it around the belly of the paint horse. The horse, a stubborn beast with a splotch of white across one eye that made it look perpetually surprised, shifted its weight and blew a cloud of steam from its nostrils. Ron murmured something low in his throat, a sound that was not quite words, and the horse settled. He ran a hand along its powerful neck, a gesture of understanding, not of mastery. His eyes, dark and deep-set, were not on his work. They were scanning the valley floor, reading the low-lying mist that clung to the creek bed, noting the way the wind, still just a whisper, stirred the tops of the ponderosa pines on the opposite slope. There was a stillness in him that seemed to come from the land itself. It was in the set of his shoulders, the slow, deliberate way he moved. It was the Apache blood from his mother, a legacy not of words or ceremony, but of a way of seeing. He saw the world not as a thing to be conquered, but as a presence to be understood. He knew the paths of the deer, the habits of the hawk, the meaning of a sky that was too clear, too blue. Today, the clouds were low and heavy, clinging to the mountaintops like dirty fleece, promising a rain that would turn the dust to a thick, clinging mud. A good day to stay close, to mend the section of fence near the north pasture that a black bear had treated with casual disrespect a few nights prior. His world was one of simple, repeating tasks: the rising sun, the needs of his stock, the setting sun. It was a life he had chosen, or perhaps a life that had chosen him. The quiet was a balm after the noise of the world he had left behind. A world of too many people with too many words and too few reasons. Here, the reasons were simple water, grass, shelter, life and death. As he reached for the bridle, a flicker of movement below caught his eye, down the slope, where his small ranch gave way to a wide, dry gravel wash carved by spring floods. Something was wrong. It wasn't the movement of deer or the slow amble of a stray cow. It was the sharp, agitated movement of men and horses. 3 riders. Their mounts were bunched together, cutting off the path of a lone figure on foot. A woman. Even from this distance, he could see the tension in the scene. The horses were restless, stomping and tossing their heads. The men were leaning forward in their saddles, their posture radiating a lazy, confident menace. And the woman, her back to a low bank of crumbling rock, was standing her ground. Her dress, a practical calico, was smudged with dust at the hem. Her bonnet had fallen back to hang by its ribbons around her neck, revealing hair the color of sun-cured hay. In her hand, held out in front of her with a tremor he could almost feel from up the hill, was a pistol. Hannah Reeves held the Colt Patterson as if it were a venomous snake she had been forced to pick up. It was her late husband's, and it felt heavy, alien in her grip. The weight of it was a terrifying responsibility. The 3 men before her seemed to find it amusing. The man in the center, a burly fellow with a tangle of a beard and a stained hat pulled low, grinned, showing teeth that were yellow and uneven. "Now, Mrs. Reeves," he drawled, his voice carrying easily in the still morning air. "Ain't no need for that. We just want to talk business." His name was Burke, and the business they had concluded yesterday, the sale of 2 horses she desperately needed and he swore were sound, had ended with her purse significantly lighter and the horses revealing themselves to be lame. Wind-broke nags, not worth their feed. "Our business is concluded. Mr. Burke," Hannah said, her voice tighter and higher than she would have liked. "You have my money. I have your horses." "Ah, but you see, there was a misunderstanding," Burke said, sharing a look with his companions. "The price we agreed on, it was for 1 horse. The other was a bonus, a gift. But my associates here feel I was too generous. We've come to collect for the second animal." It was a lie so bald, so shameless, that it stole her breath. "That's robbery." Burke's grin widened. "Where we're from, ma'am, we call it renegotiating." He swung a leg over his saddle horn, settling in as if he had all the time in the world. "Or you could just give us back that deed of sale you got, the one for your land. We'll call it even." Fear, cold and sharp, lanced through her. The deed was all she had left. Her husband, Thomas, had poured his life into that quarter section of land, and she would not let it be stolen by this scavenger. She tightened her grip on the pistol. "You'll get nothing from me. Leave now." Burke chuckled. "She's got spirit," he said to the man on his right, who spat a stream of tobacco juice near her feet. "I like spirit. Makes things more interesting." He slid off his horse, his boots crunching on the loose gravel. He began to walk toward her, slow and deliberate, like a wolf approaching a cornered sheep. "Now you give me that gun before you hurt yourself." Hannah's heart hammered against her ribs. The hammer of the Colt felt impossibly far back for her thumb to reach. She knew she had 1 chance, 1 shot, and 3 of them. The math was not in her favor. Up on the hill, Ron Hale had seen enough. He didn't know the woman, and he didn't know the men, but he knew the shape of the encounter. He had seen it 100 times in a dozen territories. It was the story of the strong preying on the weak, the oldest story in the world. He moved without thinking, his body responding to a deep-seated instinct. He slid the Winchester from its scabbard on his saddle. The rifle felt like an extension of his arm, its smooth wooden stock and cool steel barrel as familiar as his own skin. He didn't aim at any of the men. That would bring a different kind of trouble, a kind that followed a man. He aimed at the rock face above them. The crack of the rifle shot was sharp and definitive. It slammed against the morning silence, echoing across the valley. Down in the wash, a shower of rock chips and dust exploded from the cliff face, 20 feet above Burke's head. The sound was immense. It hit the opposite canyon wall and bounced back, then hit another, creating a cascade of reports that sounded like a half-dozen rifles firing at once. Burke and his men froze, their heads snapping up, their eyes wide with alarm. They spun their horses around, searching the slopes for the source of the attack. They saw nothing but trees and rock. The illusion was perfect. They were exposed, caught in the open by an unseen enemy. "Ambush!" one of the men yelled, his voice cracking with panic. Burke, for all his bluster, was no fool when it came to self-preservation. He scrambled back onto his horse, his face pale beneath his dirty beard. "Let's go," he snarled, yanking on the reins. Ron watched them for a moment, making sure they were truly spooked. Then his eyes went to the woman. She was still standing frozen, the pistol held in a white-knuckled grip. She was trapped. If she ran for the open plains, they could ride her down in minutes. But to his right, hidden from the men in the wash, was something he knew that they did not. A deer trail, a faint, almost invisible path that wound its way up the steepest part of the slope, screened by a thick stand of ponderosa pines. It was a hard climb, but it was her only way out. He raised a hand, making a quick, sharp gesture. "Go, that way!" Hannah saw the movement out of the corner of her eye. A man, high on the slope, half hidden by a rise, he was holding a rifle. For a terrifying second, she thought he was another enemy, but then he gestured again, a clear, insistent motion toward the thicket of pines to her left. He was the one who had fired, her rescuer. There was no time for questions, no time for doubt. The moment of hesitation was a luxury she couldn't afford. Burke and his men were wheeling their horses, their panic momentarily overriding their greed. She took a breath and ran. The calico dress, so practical for chores around the homestead, became a trap. Her skirt caught on sagebrush, its hem dragging in the loose stones. Her lungs burned with the effort of running up the steep incline. Branches whipped at her face, and the sharp scent of pine needles filled her senses. Behind her, she could hear the angry shouts of the men as they realized she was escaping, followed by the thunder of hooves on the hard-packed earth. She plunged into the deer trail, the trees closing around her like a protective embrace. The path was narrow and steep, a tunnel through the dense undergrowth. She scrambled, using her hands to pull herself up over rocks and roots. Her breath came in ragged, painful sobs. She didn't dare look back. She could only climb, driven by the primal fear of the predator behind her. Ron Hale watched her disappear into the trees. He then gave the paint horse a pat and, leading it by the reins, began to move parallel to her path, staying higher on the ridge. He moved through the forest with a silence that was unnatural for a man of his size wearing boots. He stepped where the ground was soft with pine needles, his movements fluid and sure. The sounds of the pursuit grew more distant, confused. The men were crashing through the brush below, their horses ill-suited for the terrain, their progress loud and clumsy. They were yelling to one another, their voices laced with frustration. After a few minutes, the sounds began to recede. They had given up the chase. He found her 100 yards up the trail. She was slumped against the trunk of a massive pine, her chest heaving, her face pale and streaked with dirt. Her knuckles were scraped raw. The pistol lay on the ground beside her, forgotten. She looked up as he approached, her eyes wide and wary, like a startled doe. The fear had not yet left them. The silence stretched between them, filled only by the sound of her gasping breaths and the gentle sigh of the wind in the high branches. The air was thick with the smell of pine and her fear, a scent like cold iron. Finally, she found her voice. It was hoarse, but laced with an unyielding thread of pride. "I can take care of myself." Ron Hale stopped a few feet away. His dark eyes took in her disheveled state, the torn hem of her dress, the scratches on her arms, the trembling that she was trying so hard to control. He looked at her not with pity, but with a simple, matter-of-fact assessment. His expression was unreadable, his face a mask carved from weathered oak. He shifted the rifle in his grip and gave a slight nod. "Then start by sitting down and breathing," he said. His voice was low and calm, a gravelly sound that seemed to carry no judgment, only a quiet statement of the obvious. It was not the response she expected. It wasn't reassurance, nor was it a dismissal of her claim. It was practical advice, delivered with an unnerving tranquility. For a moment, her pride bristled, but the command was so sensible, and her body was in such desperate agreement, that her legs gave way. She slid down the rough bark of the pine tree to sit on the bed of needles, pulling her knees to her chest. She closed her eyes and did as he said. She breathed, in and out. The frantic hammering in her chest began to slow. The world began to steady. An invisible thread, spun from shared danger and unexpected rescue, had just been drawn between them. It was thin and fragile, barely there, but it was a connection nonetheless. A primal instinct, deeper than words, began to whisper that this quiet, watchful man was not a threat in this wild, unforgiving place. That was a start. High above them, rising from the stone chimney of Ron's small, hidden cabin, A thin plume of smoke climbed into the morning sky. It was a single, wavering line, like a stitch being drawn. A faint gray thread against the vast blue canvas, forecasting a time when two frayed and separate lives might be sewn together. He led her not to the small, sturdy ranch house she had glimpsed from below, but further up the slope, along a path that seemed to dissolve into the mountainside itself. The cabin was a secret, tucked so cleverly into the landscape that she would never have found it on her own. It wasn't so much built as it was wedged into a deep recess between two towering walls of granite. Its roof a heavy thatch of sod and timber that seemed to grow directly from the earth. The front wall, made of rough-hewn logs chinked with mud and moss, was the only clear sign that it was a human dwelling. It was a shelter born of necessity, a place that valued concealment over comfort, and it seemed a perfect extension of the man who led her there. The inside was a single room, larger than it appeared from the outside, but stark in its simplicity. The air was cool and smelled of wood smoke, tanned leather, and the faint, clean scent of the pines that crowded its entrance. To one side stood a bunk, built into the wall with a thick buffalo robe for a mattress and two neatly folded wool blankets. Opposite it was a hearth of carefully fitted river stones, blackened with soot from 1,000 fires. A small collection of iron pots and a coffee pot hung from hooks hammered into the log wall. Along the back wall, tools were arranged with a craftsman's precision knives of various sizes, an adze, a draw knife, an awl, all clean and sharp. There was no clutter, no wasted space. It was the home of a man who owned only what he needed. Her eyes were drawn to the only objects in the room that did not seem strictly utilitarian. Hanging from a wooden peg near the hearth were two small drums. They were fashioned from hollowed sections of wood, their heads stretched with rawhide and held taut with leather lacing. They were small enough to be held in one hand, intimate and personal, looking less like instruments and more like the preserved, silent heartbeats of some powerful animal. Elron gestured toward the hearth. "It will be cold when the sun goes down." He took a small bundle of dry tinder and a few pieces of split pine from a wooden box. "Fire." The word was both a statement and a command. After the terror of the morning, the humiliation of the flight, Hannah felt a sudden, fierce need to reclaim some small piece of her own agency. She was not a helpless child to be ordered about. "I can do it," she said, her voice still a bit shaky but firm. He looked at her for a long moment, his dark eyes giving nothing away. Then he simply nodded and placed the tinder, a flint and a piece of steel on the hearthstones. He stepped back, giving her the space she had claimed. Pride is a poor substitute for skill. Hannah knelt, her knees protesting on the hard stone. She had built hundreds of fires in her own kitchen stove, but that was a controlled environment of paper and kindling. Here, with this primitive flint and steel, she felt clumsy and inept. She struck the steel against the flint, sending a weak shower of sparks into the tinder. A tiny wisp of smoke curled up, and she blew on it, a hopeful, desperate puff of air. The smoke vanished. She tried again, striking with more force, her frustration mounting. More sparks, another tendril of smoke, and again, her breath extinguished the fragile promise of heat. On the third try, a spark caught, and a tiny, glowing ember appeared in the tinder. She leaned in close, her hair falling around her face, and blew gently, carefully. The ember glowed brighter, then winked out, leaving only the smell of scorched fibers. She sat back on her heels, defeated. The simple act of creating warmth was beyond her. It was a bitter confirmation of her own vulnerability. She didn't hear him move, but suddenly he was there, kneeling beside her. He didn't say, "I told you so," or offer any word of criticism. He simply reached out, his hand, large and calloused, covered hers, his fingers gently repositioning her grip on the steel. A jolt, like a static charge on a dry day, went through her at the contact. It was the first time a man had touched her since her husband's death, and the unexpected warmth of his skin against hers was both a shock and a strange comfort. "Not so hard," he said, his voice a low rumble beside her ear. "Let the steel do the work." He guided her hand through the motion, a smooth, practiced flick of the wrist. A cascade of bright orange sparks showered the tinder. This time, he didn't let her blow on it. He held her hand still. "Wait," he murmured. "Let the smoke gather first." They waited, kneeling together in the silence. A thicker column of smoke began to rise, and the acrid smell grew stronger. Only then did he lean forward and blow, not with a gust, but with a long, slow, steady stream of air. The ember at the heart of the tinder ball glowed, expanded, and then, with a soft whoosh, a tiny yellow flame licked into existence. He carefully added a few slivers of wood, nursing the flame until it was strong enough to lick at the larger pieces of pine. He released her hand and sat back, his work done. Hannah stared at the growing fire, mesmerized by the dancing light. She was aware of the heat on her face and the lingering warmth on her hand where his had been. Outside, the world was changing. The golden morning light had given way to a flat, gray afternoon. The wind began to moan through the tops of the pines, and the sky, visible in the narrow strip between the granite walls, turned the color of slate. The first drops of rain fell, fat and heavy, striking the dusty ground with a sound like tiny drum beats. Then, the sky opened. The rain came down, not in drops, but in solid, wind-driven sheets. A deluge that blurred the landscape and filled the air with a roar. It hammered against the sod roof of the cabin, a relentless, powerful drumming that vibrated through the very logs of the walls. The sound should have been frightening, a reminder of the wild, untamable power of the mountains. But inside the small, fire-lit room, it felt like a blanket. The storm was a curtain, shutting them in, cutting them off from the rest of the world, from Burke and his men, from the harsh realities that waited below. The relentless noise was a thick, heavy shield that made the small space feel like the safest place on earth. Ron filled the coffee pot with water from a bucket and set it on a grate over the fire. The smell of the grounds, rich and bitter, soon joined the scent of smoke and rain. He poured the steaming liquid into 2 tin cups, handing one to her. She took it with both hands, grateful for the warmth that seeped into her chilled fingers. "He wants the deed to my land," she said, breaking the long silence. The story came out in a halting rush, the words tumbling over one another, the bad horse deal, Burke's smirking lies, the sudden, terrifying realization that he wouldn't stop until he had everything. "Thomas, my husband, he worked so hard for that place. It's all I have left of him." Ron listened without interruption, his gaze fixed on the fire. When she finished, he took a slow sip of his coffee. "You have friends in town, someone who would stand with you, the marshal?" Hannah looked down into her cup. The black liquid reflected the flickering firelight. She thought of the small, dusty town of Redemption, a place of wary glances and closed doors. She was still an outsider, the widow who kept to herself. The marshal is a friend of Burke's, and friends, no, not really. She looked up at him, a question in her eyes. "You?" A slow shake of his head was his only answer. They were 2 solitary souls, adrift in a land that did not favor the lonely. Ron stared into the flames for a moment longer. Then a wry, humorless smile touched the corner of his mouth. "Friends are like a bottle of liquor," he said, his voice flat. "Good to have, right up until the bottle's empty." The statement was so blunt, so devoid of sentiment, that it caught her completely off guard. In spite of the fear, the exhaustion, the chilling reality of her situation. A laugh escaped her. It wasn't a loud laugh, more like a sharp, surprised bark of sound. But it was genuine. It was the first time she had laughed, truly laughed, since the sound of Burke's rifle had shattered her world. The sound seemed to startle them both, a foreign noise in the quiet cabin. She took another sip of coffee, feeling the heat spread through her chest. Her curiosity, nudged awake by the unexpected moment of humor, began to stir. She looked at his profile. Silhouetted against the fire, the high cheekbones, the straight, strong line of his nose, the black hair tied back with a leather thong. "The men," she began, choosing her words carefully. "They called you. They said you were half Apache." He didn't stiffen or look away. He simply turned his head and met her gaze. He didn't confirm it, but he didn't deny it either. "Half of me understands the wind," he said, and the cryptic answer was more revealing than a simple yes or no could ever have been. It spoke of a life lived between two worlds, belonging fully to neither. A life spent listening to the language of the earth because the language of men had too often proven false. He set his cup down and reached for the small drums hanging on the wall. He settled one in his lap, and his fingers, which had been so surprisingly gentle when teaching her to make fire, began to tap against the stretched hide. It was not a loud or frantic sound. It was a slow, deliberate rhythm, a deep and steady thump, 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 like a heartbeat, strong and unhurried. The sound filled the small cabin, weaving itself into the drumming of the rain on the roof and the crackle of the fire. It was a sound that seemed to come from the very center of the earth, ancient and reassuring. Hannah closed her eyes, listening. The fear that had been a cold, hard knot in her stomach began to loosen its grip. The rhythm was hypnotic, calming the frantic pulse in her own veins. It was the sound of life, stripped down to its most essential element. "It sounds," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the rain, "like life coming back." The firelight threw their shadows, huge and dancing against the log walls. It cast a warm, flickering glow on their faces, painting them in strokes of orange and red. His face, tanned to the color of worn copper and etched with the fine lines of sun and wind, was a map of a hard-lived life. Hers, pale and drawn, was still shadowed by a grief that had not yet loosened its hold. Two faces, one marked by the wildness of the world, the other by a sorrow that had walled it off, were brought together in the intimate circle of the firelight. The rain continued its steady, relentless drumming on the roof, a lullaby for a world that had forgotten how to rest. Outside, the mountains were being washed clean. The dust of the day turned to mud, the past erased to make way for an uncertain morning. But inside the cabin, sheltered by stone and wood and the steady beat of a drum, the first night of their unlikely sanctuary passed, bound not by words or promises, but by a shared warmth and a trust as thin and as real as a single strand of smoke. The world was born anew in mist. The relentless rain of the night had passed, leaving behind a profound quiet and a world wrapped in a soft, gray shroud. Water dripped from every pine needle, a slow, steady percussion that replaced the roar of the storm. The air was scoured clean, sharp with the scent of wet earth and cold stone. Hannah woke on the floor by the hearth, a wool blanket over her, to the sight of Ron Hale standing in the cabin's open doorway, a tin cup of coffee in his hand, looking out into the vaporous morning. He seemed as much a part of the landscape as the granite cliffs, a silent watcher waiting for the world to reveal itself. She felt a deep, pressing need for water, not just to drink, but to wash away the grime and the lingering taint of fear from the day before. The flight up the mountain, the dust, the cold sweat, it all felt like a second skin she was desperate to shed. She rose quietly, folding the blanket with the neat, automatic motions of long habit. Ron heard the rustle and turned his head slightly. "Creek's down the path," he said, his voice a low murmur, as if not wanting to disturb the morning's peace. "Water's cold, but it's clean." She nodded, a silent thank you, and slipped past him out the door. The mist was so thick she could barely see 20 feet ahead. It swirled around her, cool and damp against her skin, muffling the world. She followed the sound of rushing water down a short, steep path to where the creek, swollen with the night's rain, tumbled over a series of smooth, gray stones. She found a large, flat rock at the water's edge, a natural washing table that looked as if it had been worn smooth for that very purpose by the hands of the creek itself. For a moment, She just stood there, breathing in the clean, wild air. This was the first time she had been truly alone since the confrontation with Burke. The solitude was both a relief and a source of fresh anxiety. She scanned the misty woods, her ears straining for any unnatural sound, but there was only the gurgle of water and the drip, drip, drip from the trees. Reassured, she knelt on the rock. She had no soap, no clean clothes to change into, but the cold, clear water was a luxury beyond measure. She untied her dusty boots and peeled off her stockings, then plunged her hands and face into the icy current. The shock of the cold was breathtaking, but it was a clean, honest pain that seemed to wash away the fog of exhaustion from her mind. She felt a flicker of her old self returning, the capable woman who could manage a homestead on her own. She would not be cowed by thugs like Burke or become a permanent burden on this quiet stranger. She would wash. She would think. She would make a plan. Feeling a measure of privacy in the dense fog, she unbuttoned the bodice of her dress, intending to wash as much as she could. She laid the heavy wool garment on the rock beside her, leaving her in her thin cotton chemise. Crouching low, she splashed water on her arms and neck, scrubbing at the dirt with a fierce energy. The cold was invigorating, a sharp reminder that she was alive, that she had survived. It was in that moment of focused, private ritual that the forest decided to play its hand. There was no sound, no warning, just a flash of gray-brown fur at the edge of her vision. A creature, no bigger than a half-grown dog, with clever, intelligent eyes and a long, pointed snout, darted out from a screen of ferns. It moved with the fluid, weightless grace of a ghost. Before Hannah could even register its presence, it had snatched the bundle of her dress in its jaws. With a triumphant flick of its head, it turned and vanished back into the mist-shrouded undergrowth. For a heartbeat, Hannah was too stunned to react. Her mind simply refused to process the absurd event. Then, a wave of pure, unadulterated outrage washed over her. "Hey!" she yelled, her voice sharp with disbelief. "That's my dress. You come back here." She scrambled to her feet, heedless of the cold water soaking the hem of her chemise. She took a few steps toward the thicket of buckthorn and wild raspberry canes where the creature had disappeared, then stopped, realizing the futility and the foolishness of chasing a wild animal through a thorny patch in her undergarments. All she could do was stand there, shivering and helpless, as a single, piercing shriek of utter frustration escaped her lips. The shriek was answered not by the coyote, but by the sound of boots on the gravelly path, and then, to her profound mortification, by a low, rumbling chuckle. Ron Hale emerged from the mist, his Winchester held loosely in one hand. He wasn't running as if to a threat. He was walking with a long, unhurried stride, and the corners of his mouth were twitching with an amusement he made no effort to hide. He stopped at the edge of the creek, his gaze taking in the scene her, standing soaked and indignant in her chemise, staring at an empty thicket. "Problem?" he asked, his voice laced with a dry humor that felt, at that moment, like the grossest injustice. A coyote," she sputtered, pointing a trembling finger. "It stole my dress." Ron looked from her to the thicket and back again. The chuckle escaped his control and became a genuine, quiet laugh. It wasn't a mocking sound. It was a sound of pure, unadulterated surprise at the sheer absurdity of the situation. "Well," he said, shaking his head slowly, "I've seen 'em steal chickens. Seen one try to make off with a whole saddle blanket once, but I ain't never seen a coyote with such a fine taste in fashion." His humor, instead of enraging her further, broke the spell of her anger. The ridiculousness of it all crashed down on her. A coyote, a thief with a taste for calico. A blush, hot and fierce, crept up her neck and flooded her cheeks. She crossed her arms over her chest, suddenly and painfully aware of her state of undress in front of this man. Ron's amusement faded as he saw her acute embarrassment. The laughter left his eyes, replaced by that same calm, practical assessment she had seen before. He unslung a leather pouch from his belt. "Wait here," he said, his voice returning to its usual quiet tone. He took out a long strip of dried meat, its scent sharp and smoky in the damp air. He walked to the edge of the thicket, making no effort to be quiet. "All right, you four-legged thief," he called out in a conversational tone. "Let's make a trade." He tossed the strip of jerky into the bushes. There was a rustle from within the thicket, a low growl, and then the sound of something being dropped. A moment later, Ron emerged, holding her dress. He also had a long, fresh scratch down one forearm and was pulling a cactus spine from the back of his hand. He held the dress out to her, his expression carefully neutral. "Seems he preferred the venison," he said. Hannah couldn't bring herself to meet his eyes. She was consumed by a tidal wave of humiliation. She took the dress from him, the damp wool feeling heavy and cold in her hands. Could you please turn your back?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. He didn't hesitate. He simply turned and looked out across the creek, granting her the small dignity she had requested, to fill the painfully awkward silence that followed. He began to whistle. It was a tuneless, meandering sort of sound, completely off-key, the kind of absent-minded noise a man makes when he is trying very hard to pretend he is somewhere else entirely. The sound was so clumsy, so clearly a gesture meant to cover his own discomfort as much as hers, that it was almost endearing. Under the cover of his terrible whistling, Hannah quickly pulled the cold, damp dress on over her chemise, her fingers fumbling with the buttons. When she was decent, she cleared her throat. "All right." He turned back around, the whistling cutting off abruptly. They stood for a moment in silence, a new and different kind of tension crackling between them. The rescuer and the rescued had become simply a man and a woman, caught in a moment of profound awkwardness. He gave a short nod toward the cabin. "Coffee's still hot." They walked back up the path in single file, the silence stretching between them. When they were back in the warmth of the cabin, the fire now a bed of glowing coals, Hannah turned on him. She didn't raise her voice. She just gave him a look, a clear and unambiguous glare that said, "Do not say one more word. Do not even think about making another joke." Ron saw the look and immediately raised both his hands, palms out, in a gesture of mock surrender. "Not another word," he said, his face perfectly serious, though a spark of light still danced in the depths of his dark eyes. "Today, no more teasing. Rancher's honor." The solemnity of his vow was so at odds with the situation that she had to press her lips together to keep from smiling. He had seen her at her most vulnerable, and instead of taking advantage, he had offered a clumsy, whistling courtesy and a ridiculous oath. He went about his morning chores, adding wood to the fire and slicing meat for breakfast, giving her space to recover her composure as she sat on a stool by the hearth, trying to dry the damp hem of her dress. She watched him. He took a small piece of bone from his scrap box, a piece of deer antler, polished smooth by time. With one of his smaller knives, he began to carve. His hands, which could be so strong on a cinch strap or a rifle, moved with a surprising delicacy and precision. Shaving by shaving, he worked the bone, his focus absolute. After a while, he came over to her. He opened his palm. Lying in the center was a small, intricately carved pendant. It was the head of a coyote, its snout pointed, its ears alert, its eyes seeming to hold a spark of wild mischief. It was a perfect, miniature effigy of her morning's tormentor. He held it out to her. "Here," he said quietly. "So this morning's story has an ending that knows how to laugh." Hannah looked from the carving to his face. The gesture was so unexpected, so deeply thoughtful, that it disarmed her completely. He had taken her moment of greatest humiliation and transformed it, literally carved it into something beautiful, something she could hold in her hand. He had given her back the power over the story. A smile touched her lips. It wasn't the fleeting, surprised sound of the night before. This one started slowly, a gentle curving of her mouth, and then it grew, spreading across her face and, for the first time in a very long time, reaching her eyes, lighting them from within with a warm, genuine glow. A soft laugh escaped her, a sound as clear and clean as the water in the creek. The sound of it filled the small cabin. It was a sound of release, of a burden being set down. The tight, steady beat of the drum from the night before had been the rhythm of a heart that was simply enduring, simply surviving. But this was different. This was the sound of a heart beginning, just beginning, to live again. The seed of trust, planted in the shared danger of the day before, had been watered by an off-key whistle and a ridiculous oath. And now, in the warmth of a shared laugh, it had finally broken through the cold, hard ground. The laughter of the morning faded, but it left an echo in the small cabin, a warmth that lingered in the air long after the fire had been banked to coals. It had changed the space between them. The silence was no longer just an absence of words, but a comfortable, shared territory. Yet, for Hannah, the stillness soon became a weight. She was a woman accustomed to the constant rhythm of work, her hands always busy with a task. To sit and be cared for felt like a debt she was accruing, a form of helplessness she could not abide. She watched Ron work. He was repairing a bridle, his hands moving with an unhurried, certain grace. He spliced a broken rein with a thin strip of rawhide, his awl piercing the tough leather with a soft, decisive push, his needle weaving a seam as neat and strong as any she could have sewn with thread. There was a deep, satisfying competence in his every motion. "I need something to do," she said, the words coming out more abruptly than she'd intended. "I can't just sit. I'm not good at it." He didn't look up from his work immediately. He finished a stitch, pulled it tight, and then set the bridle aside. He rose and went to a large, battered wooden chest in the corner, lifting the heavy lid. The scent of tanned hides, rich and earthy, filled the cabin. He pulled out a large side of deer leather, its surface a supple, smoky brown. He laid it on the floor and then handed her a knife. It was a simple tool, its wooden handle worn smooth with use, its blade short, curved, and honed to a razor's edge. "I need lacing," he said, "for a new pair of moccasins. Cut the thongs thin, as even as you can, a hand's width from the edge. Work your way in." He demonstrated on a scrap piece, the knife seeming to melt through the leather, leaving a perfect, slender strip behind. Then he laid the knife in her palm. Its weight felt both dangerous and purposeful. "And don't slice toward your fingers. The blade doesn't know the difference between hide and skin." Hannah knelt on the floor, spreading the large piece of leather before her. The task seemed simple enough. She placed the blade against the hide and pushed. It snagged, skittering sideways, leaving a jagged, ugly scar. She tried again, applying more force, but her angle was wrong, and the knife dug in too deep, threatening to cut through entirely. Frustration pricked at her. She, who could butcher a hog and render lard with practiced efficiency, was being defeated by a simple piece of leather. After her third failed attempt, a shadow fell over her. Ron moved with his characteristic quiet, and suddenly he was there, kneeling behind her, his presence a solid wall of warmth at her back. "You're fighting it," he said, his voice low, close to her ear. "You have to persuade it. Let the knife feel the way." Before she could react, he reached around her, his right hand covering hers, his left steadying the leather in front of her. His body was close, the scent of him wood smoke, pine, and something uniquely his own, like dust after a summer rain enveloping her. Her breath caught in her throat. His hand was hard and calloused against the back of hers, but his touch was surprisingly gentle. He adjusted her grip, tilting the blade slightly, shifting the pressure from her wrist to her forearm. "Like this," he murmured. He guided her hand, and this time, the blade sank into the hide and glided forward, smooth as a sigh, peeling away a perfect, narrow thong of leather. A small, sharp jolt went through her chest, a spark of electricity that had nothing to do with the task at hand. It was a shock of proximity, of a man's strength and warmth so near it felt as if it were seeping into her own skin. Her world for the past year had been one of memory and solitude. This sudden, living presence was overwhelming. She stiffened, her knuckles white on the knife's handle. He must have felt it, the tremor that ran through her, because he paused for a fraction of a second. But he said nothing. He simply continued to guide her hand, his breathing a slow, steady rhythm beside her ear. They cut another strip, then another, the pile of perfect leather laces growing beside them. They were two people pretending they were only teaching and learning a skill. Two bodies pretending they were not acutely, intensely aware of each other. When he was sure she had the feel of it, he slowly, deliberately, withdrew his hands and stood up, moving back to his own side of the cabin as if nothing had happened. Hannah kept her eyes fixed on the leather, her face hot, her heart hammering a wild, uneven beat against her ribs. They worked through the afternoon in a silence that was industrious and thick with unspoken things. While Ron finished mending the bridle, his needle dipping and rising with hypnotic regularity, Hannah sat by the hearth, her own task forgotten for a moment. She had taken off her boots to dry them, and she now held them in her lap, turning them over. It was only then that she noticed the mud from her frantic climb the day before was gone. Someone had carefully scraped it all away, even from the deep grooves in the soles. She looked over at Ron, bent over his work, his expression unreadable. It was such a small thing, a quiet act of care performed without announcement or expectation of thanks. It was, she thought, the sort of thing a husband might do. The thought was a betrayal, and she pushed it away, but it left a lingering warmth behind. The silence eventually gave way to words, not in a rush, but in small, carefully offered fragments, like two people exchanging rare and fragile things. "This ranch," he said, testing a new stitch for strength. "Your husband's—"
"Yes,"
she said, her voice quiet.
"Thomas, he put everything into it. We both did. When he died, there were debts.
I've been trying to rebuild, to make it profitable enough to hold on to." She didn't speak of the loneliness, or the crushing weight of doing it all on her own, but the words hung in the air between them. He was silent for a long time. Then he said, "It's better to be alone." It wasn't a question or an opinion, but a statement of fact, a conclusion reached after a long and difficult journey. "Why?" she asked, genuinely curious about the source of his deep-seated solitude. He looked up then, his dark eyes meeting hers across the small room. The guarded expression was gone, replaced by a profound, weary clarity. "People talk too much," he said, his voice flat and hard, "and they're too quick to pull a trigger." It was a whole chapter of his life, a story of betrayal and violence, condensed into a single, bitter sentence. He offered no more details, and she knew not to ask. Later, when the light began to fail, he led her down to the creek to fetch more water. The mist had burned off, leaving the air crisp and clear. He stopped and pointed to the damp earth at the water's edge. "Look!" She saw a confusion of marks in the mud. To her, they were meaningless. To him, they were a language. "Deer," he said, tracing a cloven hoof print with his finger. "A doe and her fawn passed this way just after sunrise." He moved a few feet, pointing to a different set of tracks, smaller, with distinct claw marks. "Raccoon, looking for crawdads." He showed her the delicate print of a quail, the heavy, deliberate track of a porcupine. "It's all a story," he said. "Every track, every broken twig. It's the forest's alphabet. You just have to learn how to read it." She looked from the tracks on the ground to his face, which was alive with a quiet, focused intensity. "It's more than that," she said, the realization dawning on her. "You don't just read it. You can hear the grass and the trees." He straightened up and looked out at the vast expanse of pine and rock, a faint, sad smile touching his lips. "Everyone used to," he said softly. they just forgot the language. As they stood there, a sudden shift in the wind brought a new scent to the air. It was a cold, sharp, metallic smell. The scent of high places, of snow that had lain in the deep shadows of the peaks all summer long. Ron lifted his head, his nostrils flaring, like a buck testing the air for danger. His calm demeanor vanished, replaced by a watchful stillness. "He'll be back," Ron said, his voice low and certain. "Burke, he's not the kind to give up. He'll think we're still hiding. Tonight they'll check the high ground, the places with a long view." He looked up at the granite cliffs that sheltered his cabin. "They'll come near here." The fear she had managed to keep at bay all day returned in a cold rush. But this time, it was different. It was not the panicked terror of a cornered animal, but a cold, clear-eyed awareness of a known threat. They walked back to the cabin in silence. That evening, he handed her something heavy and metallic. It was a small, compact pistol, a Derringer, much smaller and lighter than her husband's unwieldy Colt. Its metal was cool against her skin, its wooden grip smooth and worn. "You know how to use it?" he asked. She nodded. "Good," he said. "Keep it with you. You'll sleep better holding this." He was giving her more than a weapon. He was giving her a piece of his trust, empowering her to be a partner in their defense, not just a victim in need of rescue. That night, they ate a hunter's stew, a thick, savory mixture of venison, wild onions, and dried mushrooms that he had cooked in a single iron pot over the fire. They ate in their usual silence, but the air was charged with the coming threat. The storm had passed, but another was gathering. As the fire crackled and the shadows danced on the walls, the quiet meal and the shared danger opened a silent door between them, a space where the stories of past mistakes and old wounds could be acknowledged without ever needing to be spoken aloud. They were two solitary people, each with a past they preferred to keep buried, preparing to face a new danger. Together. The stew was gone, but its warmth lingered in their bellies, a small anchor against the encroaching chill of the night. Outside, the world had been stripped of color, reduced to shades of black and deep, starless gray. The wind had picked up, and it soughed through the pines with a mournful, lonely sound, a constant reminder of their isolation and the threat that might be riding on its currents. The fire in the hearth was the only source of light and life, a small, defiant circle of orange in the vast darkness. It painted their faces in flickering strokes, casting long, dancing shadows that seemed to have a life of their own. Hannah sat on the stool, her hands wrapped around a cup of hot water, though she wasn't drinking. Her gaze was fixed on the flames, but her eyes saw something else entirely. The expectation of violence had a way of stripping away the present, of forcing a reckoning with the past. Danger made a person take stock of what they stood to lose, and in Hannah's case, what she had already lost. Her thumb moved in a slow, unconscious circle over the front of her dress, tracing the outline of the small, silver locket that lay hidden beneath the fabric. It was a gesture she had made 1,000 times, a nervous habit that had outlived its purpose. "He died in a border dispute," she said, her voice so quiet it was almost carried away by the wind outside. She didn't look at Ron. She spoke to the fire, as if it were an old confessor. "It was over a line fence, a stupid, meaningless argument about a few feet of dusty ground. Our neighbor, Mr. Abernathy, claimed Thomas had moved the markers. Thomas said he hadn't. Words got hot. It was all over in a minute." She fell silent, the memory playing out behind her eyes, the sound of the shouts, the terrible final crack of the rifle shot, the sight of her husband falling in the dust, the world tilting on its axis. "He was a good man," she continued, her voice flat, scrubbed clean of emotion. "A gentleman. He wasn't a fighter, but he was proud. He wouldn't be accused of being a thief." She finally pulled the locket out from under her collar. It was a simple, oval piece of silver, tarnished with age. With a thumbnail, she pried it open. "I used to keep a tiny portrait of him in here,
And a lock of our daughter's hair. She passed from fever the winter before. She held it out. The 2 small frames inside were empty. The day of the funeral, I took them out. I thought it would help me to let go, to accept that they were gone. A dry, mirthless sound, half sob, half laugh, escaped her. It didn't. Now it's just an empty locket, but I can't seem to take it off. The habit of wearing it is all I have left. Ron listened, his stillness a form of attention more profound than any words of sympathy could have been. He didn't offer platitudes. He didn't say he was sorry for her loss. He simply sat there across the fire from her, a silent witness to her grief. He knew, better than most, that some wounds were too deep for the balm of easy words. When she had tucked the locket away and fallen silent again, he shifted his position, the leather of his boots creaking softly. He stared into the heart of the fire, at the glowing, incandescent core of the logs as they crumbled into embers. "I had a wife," he said, his voice a low, gravelly rasp. "And a son. His name was Taza. It means little hawk. He had his mother's eyes." He paused, and the silence that followed was heavy with the weight of things unsaid. Hannah waited, knowing that this was a story he did not tell often, if ever. "We were living with her people, down on the San Pedro. The army came. They made promises, a new treaty, rations, land that would be ours forever. They said we had to move to a new camp, just for a short while, across the river, for our own protection. They said—" He picked up a small stick from the hearth and began to trace patterns in the dirt floor, his gaze fixed on the meaningless lines. "I argued against it. I didn't trust them. But the elders, they were tired of fighting. They wanted to believe in the promises. My wife, Nalin, she said we should go, for Taza's sake, so he could have a life without running." He stopped tracing and stared at the stick in his hand as if he'd forgotten it was there. He tossed it into the fire, where it was instantly consumed by the flames. "I went out with a hunting party to bring in meat for the new camp. We were gone 3 days. The first night we were gone, a flash flood came down the canyon, a wall of water. It happens in that country. The river changed its banks overnight. It tore through the new camp, the one the army had chosen, the one on the low ground." He looked up from the fire, and for the first time, Hannah saw past the stoic mask, saw the raw, unending agony that lay beneath. His eyes were like windows into a burned-out house. "I believed them," he said, and the 2 words were freighted with a universe of self-loathing. "I let them go. When I got back, there was nothing left, just mud and debris. The river had taken everything. He had lost his family not to a bullet or a sickness, but to a treaty, to a promise, to his own momentary failure of instinct. 2 gaping wounds, 2 vast, empty spaces in their lives, now lay exposed in the quiet of the cabin. They recognized each other then, not as a man and a woman, not as a rescuer and a victim, but as 2 survivors of the same shipwreck, washed up on the same deserted shore. There was nothing to say. Words were useless in the face of such loss. Slowly, Hannah reached across the small space that separated them. She didn't say his name. She didn't offer comfort. She simply laid her hand on top of his, where it rested on his knee. Her hand was small and calloused from work. His was large and hard, scarred and weathered. It was a simple, human gesture, a quiet acknowledgement. "I see your pain. It is a brother to my own." His fingers did not move, but he did not pull away. They sat that way for a long time, the only movement the flicker of the firelight, their 2 hands joined in a silent pact of shared grief. After a while, he gently withdrew his hand and stood up. He walked to the wall where the 2 small drums hung. He took one down and brought it back to the fire, settling it in his lap. It was a beautiful object. The rawhide head stretched taut and pale over the dark, polished wood. He ran a thumb over its surface, a gesture of deep familiarity. "Try," he said, holding it out to her. She took it, surprised by its lightness. It felt warm, alive in her hands. She held it awkwardly, unsure of what to do. "Just your fingers," he said, "slow, like a heart." She hesitated, then tapped the surface with the pads of her fingers. A sound emerged, low and resonant, a deep, earthy thrum that seemed to vibrate not just in the air, but inside her own chest. Thump, thump. It was the sound of the earth's pulse. It felt ancient, grounding. She tapped it again. A slow, steady rhythm. The sound was strangely calming, a quiet insistence of life in the face of the wailing wind. The stone of her grief, which had been lodged in her chest for so long, felt warmer. "When the silence gets too loud," he said, his eyes on the fire again. "When I can't sleep, I tap out the heartbeat. The world keeps turning, even when you wish it would stop." A small, sad smile touched Hannah's lips. The practicality of it, the profound simplicity of his method for enduring the unendurable, was so characteristic of the man. "You're a philosopher who smells of smoke," she said softly. He shook his head, a hint of his dry humor returning. "No," he said, "just a man who learned everything the hard way." As he spoke, a log in the fire shifted, sending a shower of bright orange sparks into the air. One small, glowing ember drifted out and landed on the sleeve of his canvas shirt, where it began to smolder, without thinking. Hannah reached out and brushed it away with her fingers, a quick, instinctive gesture to prevent a burn. The ember was gone, but her fingertips lingered on the rough fabric of his sleeve for a single, charged heartbeat longer than was necessary. It was a touch that was different from before. The first had been one of solemn empathy. This was something else, something warmer, more tentative. He looked at her, and their eyes met in the flickering light. The ghosts of their pasts were still there, in the room with them. The specters of a dead husband, a lost wife, and a child named Little Hawk would not be banished so easily. But for the first time, they were not alone with them. The shared weight, somehow, was lighter. The darkness outside the cabin door still held the threat of Burke and his men. But inside, the night was no longer a realm of haunted memories. It had become something else, a quiet promise that even after the deepest loss, a new day and a new life might still be possible. Sleep did not come easily. It was a shallow, restless state, haunted by the whisper of the wind and the knowledge of what the dawn might bring. Ron was awake before the first hint of light, his senses already reaching out into the darkness, listening. But the first warning came not as a sound, but as a smell. It was the scent of smoke, but it wasn't the clean, resinous smoke from their own hearth. This was a heavier, greasier smell, the smell of a large, poorly made fire, carried on the morning breeze from the south. It was the smell of carelessness, of men who did not belong in these mountains and did not respect their silence. He rose from his bunk in a single, fluid motion and went to the doorway. Stepping out into the pre-dawn chill, a faint, hazy line of dust, like a low-lying cloud, was visible against the horizon, catching the first pale rays of the hidden sun. They were coming. Hannah was already awake, sitting up with a small derringer clutched in her hand. The shared confession of the previous night had forged a new bond between them, but the threat of the coming day had drawn a taut line of tension over it. She saw the look on his face and needed no words. "How many?" she asked, her voice a dry whisper. "Can't tell yet." He went back inside and retrieved an old spyglass from the wooden chest. Its brass body was dented and its leather casing was cracked with age, but the lens was clear. He returned to the doorway, resting the glass on the sturdy frame to steady his hand. He adjusted the focus, the landscape leaping forward in a blurry rush before sharpening into detail. He was silent for a long time, his body utterly still as he scanned the valley below. The terrain itself seemed to hold its breath. The granite cliffs were silent sentinels. The pines stood like a waiting army, and the creek was the only thing that dared to make a sound. 4. he said at last, his voice flat. He shifted the glass slightly. No, 5. Burke's in the lead, on that big roan of his. He collapsed the spyglass with a sharp snap. The sound was unnaturally loud in the quiet morning. Hannah's heart began a slow, heavy pounding against her ribs. 5 of them. The odds were impossible. "Do we run?" she asked, the words tasting of defeat before they were even fully spoken. Ron looked from the valley floor up to the rocky fortress that surrounded them. He considered the paint horse and his mule, tethered in a small, hidden box canyon 100 yards away. "No," he said, his decision absolute. "They're moving slow, checking the high ground. If they see our tracks, if they see the horses move, they'll know exactly where we are. Here." He swept a hand toward the cabin and the cliffs. "The rock is our friend. It gives us cover. Out there." He didn't need to finish. Out there, they were just prey in an open field. "We hold." The decision, once made, settled the air. The nervous energy of waiting was replaced by the focused purpose of preparation. Ron moved with an efficiency that was both calming and terrifying to watch. He wasn't panicking. He was working a problem, like a carpenter figuring the angles of a roof joist. He went to a small, locked box he kept under his bunk and took out a tightly wrapped oilskin packet. Inside was a coil of fuse and a small, heavy pouch of black powder. He led Hannah outside to the large woodpile stacked against the rock face a dozen yards from the cabin door. It was a season's worth of fuel, a massive, dense wall of split pine and oak. "Insurance," he said. "For the front door." He carefully laid a thin, continuous trail of black powder from the base of the woodpile, weaving it through the dry grass and pine needles until it ended just behind a large boulder near the cabin. Then he laid the fuse along the same path. He was creating a trap, turning his own winter warmth into a weapon. He handed Hannah the Winchester rifle and a pouch heavy with cartridges. "Load this," he said, "and the pistol. Then load them again. Do it until you don't have to think about it." Hannah took the rifle. Its weight was substantial, solid. She sat on the ground, her back against the log wall of the cabin, and began the task. Her fingers felt clumsy and thick, the brass cartridges cold and alien. The first time she tried to work the lever action and slide around into the chamber, her hands shook so badly that she dropped the bullet. It fell to the ground with a soft thud that sounded to her like a cannon shot. Tears of frustration pricked at her eyes. Ron saw her struggle. He knelt in front of her, not taking the rifle from her, but simply waiting. "Look at me," he said, his voice quiet but firm. She lifted her head. "Don't think about them as men," he said, his dark eyes holding hers. "Don't think about Burke's face or what they might do. That's not your concern. Think of them as shadows that have lost their way back to the light. Your job is just to hold the line, to keep the darkness from crossing it. That's all." His words were strange, almost mystical, but they worked. They reframed the task, turning it from an act of potential violence into an act of defense, of preservation. She was no longer a frightened woman preparing to take a life. She was a guardian of a boundary. She took a deep breath, picked up the cartridge, and this time, her fingers were steady. The round slid home with a satisfying, metallic click. She worked the action again and again, the motions becoming smoother, more certain, until her hands knew the rhythm of the rifle as well as they knew the rhythm of kneading bread. An hour passed. The sun climbed higher, burning away the mist, and the day grew warmer. Then came the sound, a voice carried on the wind, echoing off the canyon walls. "Hale, Ron Hale, I know you're up there. You skulking half-breed." It was Burke's voice, thick with arrogance. "You can't hide forever. Send out the woman, and we might just let you live. A man like you ain't got no use for a white woman anyway." Ron, who was crouched behind a rocky outcrop with a spyglass, didn't move, but Hannah saw the muscles in his jaw bunch into hard knots. The insult, so casually, cruelly delivered, was a physical blow. For a moment, a flicker of raw, dangerous anger flared in his eyes. Then, he took a slow, deliberate breath, and the tension visibly drained out of him. He let the anger go, setting it aside like a tool he had no use for at the moment. He was a rock, and Burke's words were just wind.
"They're spreading out," Ron said, his voice a low, calm whisper. "Horseshoe formation, trying to flank us. One of them is breaking off, circling around to the west. He'll try to come in from above, behind the cabin."
He looked back at her, his eyes now cold and clear. All emotion burned away. "Front and back," he said. "Stay low, and don't shoot until I do." Hannah nodded, her mouth dry. She moved to the single small window at the back of the cabin, a narrow slit just wide enough for a rifle barrel. She peered out, her world shrinking to that small, dusty rectangle of light. She could see the tops of the trees, the steep slope of the canyon wall. Nothing more. The waiting was the worst part. The silence stretched, thick and heavy, punctuated only by the buzz of a fly and the frantic beating of her own heart. The first shot came with a deafening crack that seemed to rip the fabric of the world. It wasn't aimed at either of them. It was a probing shot, a shot to test their position. The bullet slammed into the thick log wall just beside the doorway with a tremendous, percussive thud, sending a shower of splinters into the cabin. Hannah flinched, biting back a cry. Ron didn't even flinch. He rose smoothly from his crouch, the Winchester already at his shoulder. He wasn't aiming at Burke, who was still too far away and partially concealed. He aimed at one of the flanking riders, a man who had foolishly exposed himself for a moment from behind a stand of aspens. Ron fired. The report of his rifle was sharper, harder than Burke's. It echoed across the canyon, a definitive, deadly statement. The shot was followed instantly by a high, terrified scream not from a man, but from a horse. The sound was terrible, a raw sound of pain and panic that shattered the peace of the forest. It was followed by the crash of a falling body, man and animal going down in a tangle of limbs. The forest erupted. The remaining men began firing wildly, their bullets thudding into the log walls, whining off the granite cliffs. It was a storm of noise and lead. Ron had already dropped back down behind the cover of the rocks. He pulled a match from his pocket, struck it on the rough stone, and cupped the small flame in his hands. He touched it to the end of the fuse. "Get ready to move," he said, his voice tight. Hannah watched, mesmerized. As the fuse caught, it began to sputter and hiss, a tiny, glowing serpent of fire eating its way along the trail of black powder, racing toward the woodpile. Down below, Burke saw the flicker of movement, the thin trail of smoke snaking through the grass. A look of confusion, then dawning horror, crossed his face. He understood what was happening a second too late. "It's a trap!" he roared, yanking on his reins. "Fall back!" But the fire was too fast. It reached the base of the woodpile. For a single, silent moment, nothing happened. Then, with a deafening, concussive whoomp, the black powder ignited. It wasn't a fireball, not an explosion that threw logs 100 feet in the air. It was a massive, violent burst of force and smoke. The entire woodpile seemed to leap into the air and then disintegrate into a maelstrom of flying splinters, burning chunks of wood, and a roiling, impenetrable cloud of thick, black smoke. The sound was a physical blow, a punch to the chest that stole the air from their lungs. The two-legged wolves were thrown into chaos. Their horses, already spooked by the gunfire and the scream of their fallen companion, reared and bolted in terror, their riders struggling to stay in the saddle. The man who had been circling around to the back was thrown from his mount as it shied from the sudden, terrifying noise. Burke was enveloped in the thick, choking smoke, shouting useless orders that were lost in the confusion. For a few precious seconds, their attackers were blind, deaf, and panicked. Their perfect horseshoe had shattered.
and through the dense, swirling cloud of smoke, a narrow corridor had been opened, a temporary doorway leading away from the cabin and into the relative safety of the deep woods. It was their only chance. The world exploded. One moment there was the tense silence of the siege. The next, the universe was a deafening roar and a fist of violent air. The force of the blast slammed into the cabin, shaking the very logs. Smoke, thick and black and tasting of sulfur and burnt pine, billowed out from the woodpile, a choking, blinding curtain that instantly blotted out the sun. "Now!" Ron's voice cut through the ringing in Hannah's ears. A sharp, urgent command. There was no time for thought, only a primal, desperate instinct to move. They burst from the cabin door, plunging into the swirling chaos. The air was a thick, hot soup of smoke and flying debris. Hannah's lungs burned, her eyes streamed. She ran blindly, one hand outstretched, until she collided with something solid. Ron's back. He grabbed her arm, his grip like iron, and pulled her down with him, shoving her behind the immense, fallen trunk of a long-dead ponderosa. The log, a splintered rampart wide as a man is tall, became their new world, their only shield. They crouched behind it, gasping for air, their ears still humming from the explosion. The world outside their sanctuary was a cacophony of panicked shouts, the terrified whinnying of horses, and the crackle of burning wood. And then, the gunfire started again, wilder this time, more desperate. A bullet tore through the smoke and ripped a long, angry splinter from the log just inches from Hannah's head. She flinched back with a cry, the acrid smell of freshly torn wood filling her nostrils. Another bullet punched through a rotted section of the trunk, buzzing past her sleeve with the sound of an angry hornet. The fabric of her dress tore, a phantom touch of death that left her skin cold. From Ron's side of the log came a sharp hiss of breath. A bullet had grazed his ear, leaving a bright red line, a stark punctuation mark against his dark skin. Ron's world was a series of tactical calculations. The smoke was their ally, but it was thinning, dissipating on the morning wind. The confusion he had sown was a fleeting advantage. He risked a quick look over the log. One man was on the ground, tangled with his screaming, wounded horse. Another, the one who had tried to circle behind, was on foot, trying to catch his panicked mount. That left two still in the saddle, plus Burke, who was now emerging from the smoke, his face a mask of black soot and pure fury. They were disorganized, but they were still armed, and they were closing in. Hannah saw the shift in his eyes. He was no longer just defending. He was thinking, planning his next move. The bullets were concentrating on their position, thudding into the old wood with a relentless, terrifying rhythm. He knew they couldn't stay pinned down. He looked at her, and for a fraction of a second, his hard, tactical gaze softened. It was a look that said everything he couldn't say with words, a silent apology for the danger he had brought her into, a fierce promise to see her through it. Then, before she could process the look, before she could understand his intent, he moved. He was deliberately shifting his position, drawing his body away from hers, making himself a more visible target. He was pulling their fire. He was using himself as bait. The realization hit her with the force of a physical blow. "No!" The word was ripped from her throat, a raw, desperate plea. But it was too late. He had already risen from his crouch, stepping out from behind the relative safety of the log. He moved with a calm, lethal grace that was terrifying to behold. His Winchester came to his shoulder in a single fluid motion. He fired once. The man on foot, the one trying to catch his horse, crumpled to the ground. He fired again. One of the mounted men cried out and clutched at his arm, dropping his rifle as he fought to control his spooked horse. It was a masterclass in deadly efficiency. 2 shots, 2 threats neutralized, but it had cost him. In that brief, exposed moment, Burke, his face contorted in a snarl of rage, brought his own rifle up. The crack of the shot was flat and ugly. Hannah saw Ron flinch, a violent, brutal punch to his left shoulder that spun him half around. His rifle clattered to the ground. A look of surprise crossed his face, as if he couldn't quite believe he had been hit. His leg buckled. He went down, not with a crash, but in a slow, crumbling heap, landing hard in the dirt and pine needles. Time seemed to stop. The world, for Hannah, narrowed to the sight of Ron's still form on the ground. The remaining riders, seeing their leader press the attack and their adversary fall, began to regain their courage. Burke dismounted and started walking toward Ron's body, his pistol now in his hand. "Well, well, widow," Burke called out, his voice dripping with venomous satisfaction. He was savoring his victory. "Looks like your half-breed hero ran out of tricks. Gonna cry for him. Little lady, you can beg for me. Next." Something inside Hannah snapped, the fear that had been her constant companion for 2 days. The cold, paralyzing terror was burned away in a white-hot flash of pure, undiluted rage. There was no room for panic, no time for tears. There was only the sight of the man who had saved her lying wounded, and the monster who had shot him walking closer. Her hand, as if with a will of its own, moved. It didn't reach for the small derringer tucked in her dress. It slid across the ground, her fingers searching, until they found the heavy, reassuring weight of the pistol still tucked into Ron's belt. Her husband's old Colt Patterson had felt heavy and alien. This gun, Ron's gun, felt like an extension of her own hand. It felt right. Her fingers closed around the grip. The metal was warm from his body. She pulled it free. There was no shaking. Her hand was as steady as the granite cliffs that surrounded them. All the lessons of her life on the frontier, the grit, the resilience, the stubborn refusal to break all of it coalesced into this single, final moment. She rose from behind the log, the pistol held out in front of her in a firm, two-handed grip. Burke stopped, his victorious smirk faltering as he saw her. He saw not a weeping widow, but something else entirely, something he did not recognize. He saw a woman whose grief had been forged into a weapon. He raised his own pistol, a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. The world was silent except for the crackle of the burning woodpile and the ringing in her ears. She saw Burke's face, his mouth opening to spit another taunt. She saw the front sight of the pistol. She aligned the two, just as Thomas had taught her so long ago in a calmer, happier time. She squeezed the trigger. The sound of the shot was deafening, a final, definitive crack that echoed through the canyon. Burke's taunt died in his throat. A look of profound, almost comical surprise washed over his face. A small, dark hole appeared in the center of his chest. He didn't cry out. He didn't stagger. He simply folded, his legs giving way beneath him as if a string had been cut, and collapsed into a heap on the ground. The two remaining members of his gang stared, their faces slack with disbelief. Their leader was down. Their fight was over. One of them, the man Ron had wounded in the arm, wheeled his horse around and spurted into a frantic gallop, disappearing back down the trail. The other, after a moment's hesitation, followed suit, fleeing into the hot, smoky air. And then there was silence, a profound, ringing silence broken only by the hiss of the dying fire and the ragged sound of her own breathing. The pistol fell from her nerveless fingers. She didn't watch the men flee. She scrambled to Ron's side, falling to her knees in the dirt. His eyes were open, but they were glazed with pain. A dark, ugly stain was spreading across the shoulder of his shirt. "Ron," she said, her voice cracking. "Stay with me." She tore a strip of cloth from her petticoat and pressed it hard against the wound, trying to staunch the bleeding. Her hands were covered in his blood. "You listen to me, Ron Hale," she said, her voice fierce, desperate. "You are not allowed to die. You are not allowed. You inconvenient, stubborn man." A faint, pained smile touched his lips. His eyes focused on her face, and a spark of the man she knew returned to them. He drew a ragged, painful breath. "Straighter shot," he whispered,
his voice barely a rasp. Then me. His eyes fluttered closed. The smoke from the fire began to recede, drifting away on the wind, leaving behind a scarred, blackened patch of earth and the two of them, their heartbeats loud but ragged in the sudden, terrible quiet. It was in that quiet that a new sound emerged, the rhythmic beat of approaching horses. Not the panicked retreat of Burke's men, but the steady, organized sound of a posse. Hannah looked up. A group of riders was coming up the trail, drawn by the sounds of the gunfight. At their lead was a man with a silver star pinned to his vest, Marshal Boone from Redemption. Beside him, incongruously, rode the town's elderly preacher, Reverend Miller, his face grim. The marshal reined in his horse, his eyes taking in the scene with a practiced, weary gaze, the dead men, the smoldering ruins of the woodpile, Hannah kneeling over Ron's bleeding form. He looked at Hannah, his expression unreadable. "Looks like you had some trouble, Mrs. Reeves," he said, the understatement as dry as the dust on his boots. He dismounted, his gaze falling on Burke's body. "I've been looking for Jed Burke for a long time." He nudged the body with his toe, then looked back at Hannah, at the pistol lying in the dirt beside her, at the fierce, protective way she held her hand over Ron's wound. A slow nod of understanding passed over his face. "Looks to me," he said, his voice carrying the weight of the law in that wild land, "like justice found its own way here today." The frontier had delivered its own verdict, and it had chosen to stand with the living. Time lost its shape. It became a rhythm of light and shadow, heat and chill, measured not by the sun, but by the rasp of Ron's breathing. For 2 days and 2 nights, the small cabin was a world suspended, a crucible where life and death waged a silent, fevered war. Hannah was the sole inhabitant of this world, its keeper and its anchor. She sat on a hard, 3-legged stool beside his bunk, a position that became as familiar to her as the chair in her own kitchen. The stool was her post, the bunk her battlefield. Reverend Miller had helped Marshal Boone's men carry Ron inside, his preacher's coat shed, his sleeves rolled up, revealing the wiry arms of a man who knew his way around more than just a Bible. He had cleaned the wound with whiskey, the raw spirit making Ron cry out in his delirium, a sound that tore at something deep inside Hannah. The preacher had probed for the bullet with a steady, practiced hand, his face grim, and had finally extracted a misshapen lump of lead. "The rest is up to the Lord, and the boy's own grit," he had said, placing a pouch of dried herbs on the small table. "Boil these, for the fever, and keep him cool." So that is what she did. She became a creature of simple, repeating tasks. She kept the fire low, just enough to heat the water. She brewed the bitter, earthy-smelling tea and forced spoonfuls of it between Ron's cracked lips. She fetched endless buckets of cold water from the creek, the handle biting into her palms. She dipped cloths into the water, wrung them out, and laid them gently on his forehead, his neck, his chest, chasing the relentless, burning heat that radiated from his skin. When a cloth grew warm, she would replace it with a fresh, cool one. It was a constant, exhausting rotation, a small, desperate fight against an invisible enemy. The silence was the hardest part. It was a living thing, a heavy blanket that threatened to smother the last vestiges of life in the room. His breathing was a ragged, shallow counterpoint to the quiet, sometimes hitching, sometimes descending into a low moan that spoke of a pain beyond consciousness. To fight the silence, she began to talk. She did not talk of the gunfight, or of Burke, or of the fear that was a cold, hard knot in her own stomach. She talked of nonsense, of the mundane, trivial things that make up a life, weaving a slender thread of words to tether him to the world. "That paint horse of yours," she murmured, her voice a low, steady drone as she bathed his face. "He's a stubborn one. Watched him this morning trying to pull a whole branch of leaves through the fence instead of just taking one. Reminds me of my old mule, Obadiah."
That animal would have stood in a river and argued with the current if he could have. She told him about her plans for her small ranch, how she was going to put in a new section of fence come spring, how she thought she might be able to get a better price for her cattle if she drove them to the railhead herself instead of selling to the local agent. She described the way the morning light hit the eastern slope of her valley, turning the grass the color of honey. She spoke of the taste of the first wild plums of summer and the smell of the air just before a thunderstorm. She talked until her throat was raw, her voice hoarse. She did it not for herself, but for him. She was filling the space around him with life, with the small, ordinary details of a world that was still waiting for him. A world he had to fight to come back to, in the deepest, darkest hours of the second night. When his breathing grew so shallow, she had to lean in close to feel the faint warmth of it on her cheek. She leaned down and whispered in his ear, "You stay. Ron Hale. You hear me. You stay. I'm not done talking yet." On the morning of the third day, the heat finally broke. She laid a hand on his forehead, and for the first time, it felt like skin, not a furnace. The raggedness in his breathing eased into a slow, deep, and even rhythm. Exhaustion, heavy and absolute, crashed down on her. She slumped onto the stool, her head falling forward onto her arms on the edge of his bunk, and for the first time in 2 days, she slept. She was woken by a voice. It was a rough, cracked sound, like stones grinding together. "Where's the coffee?" Hannah's head snapped up. Her heart leaped into her throat. Ron's eyes were open. They were clear. The fever haze was gone. He was looking at her, a flicker of his old, dry self visible in their dark depths. He looked pale, exhausted, and was grimacing in pain from his shoulder. But he was there. He was back. All the tension, all the fear, all the desperate, whispered prayers of the past 2 days erupted out of her in a single, explosive sound. It started as a laugh, a sharp, incredulous bark of pure, unadulterated joy. Then, just as quickly, the laugh caught in her throat and shattered, turning into a sob. The relief was so immense, so overwhelming. It was a physical pain. She buried her face in her hands and wept, not with sorrow, but with the profound, bone-deep gratitude of a battle won. Later that day, Marshal Boone rode up alone. He was a man who wore his authority not like a uniform, but like an old, comfortable coat. He dismounted, his movements slow and deliberate, and accepted the cup of coffee Hannah offered him. He looked at Ron, who was now propped up against the wall of the bunk, sipping a cup of weak, sweet tea. "Heard you were still among the living," Boone said. It was his version of a heartfelt greeting. He turned his attention to Hannah. "We buried them. Burke and his men. The circuit judge will be through next month, but it'll just be a formality. I took statements from the 2 that ran. They were so scared of you, ma'am," he said with a hint of a smile. "They couldn't tell the truth fast enough. It's as clear a case of justifiable self-defense as I've ever seen. Burke was a bad seed. The world's a quieter place without him." He drank his coffee, his eyes scanning the quiet cabin, the mended bullet holes in the wall, the peaceful valley beyond the doorway. He was a man who understood the harsh calculus of the frontier. But quiet is a hard thing to find. Once it's been lost, he said, more to himself than to them. He looked from Ron to Hannah, his gaze lingering for a moment. He had seen them in town. He knew her as the grieving widow, trying to make a go of it on her own. He knew him as the solitary rancher with the Apache blood, a man who kept to himself and was regarded with a mixture of fear and suspicion by the townsfolk. "The story's all over redemption," he said, his voice gentle but direct. "The widow and the half-Apache rancher, taking on the Burke gang. You know how people talk. Stories get twisted. They grow thorns." He set his empty cup down. "This is good country," he said, looking out the door. "But it has a long memory. My advice, for what it's worth, find a new place. A place where you're not a story. Go somewhere the past can get some sleep. Give it a chance to forget your names. He tipped his hat. Ma'am, hail. And with that, he mounted his horse and rode away, leaving his words hanging in the air behind him. The rumors he spoke of were not a ghost. They were real. When Hannah had to ride into Redemption for supplies a few days later, she felt them. It was in the way the women in the general store stopped talking when she entered. It was in the way men looked at her, a new, speculative curiosity in their eyes. She was no longer just the widow Reeves. She was part of a story now, a violent, romantic, and scandalous tale that had taken on a life of its own. She returned to the cabin to find Ron standing outside, testing the strength in his wounded shoulder. He saw the look on her face, the weary set of her jaw, and he knew. They stood there in the late afternoon sun, the silence stretching between them. They had a choice. They could stay here, in their separate solitudes, and live forever in the shadow of the story the town had written for them. Or they could listen to the marshal's advice. They could run. But the choice felt different. This time, it wasn't about running from something. It was about running to something else. They looked at each other, and in that shared glance, a decision was made without a single word being spoken. They had both spent too long being defined by the past. A week later, they were ready. They packed what little they had onto Ron's mule and his paint horse. Hannah left her homestead in the care of the Reverend, to be sold when a buyer could be found. They didn't go south, toward the established towns. They turned north, following the restless silver ribbon of a river as it wound its way deeper into the mountains, into country that was marked on the maps as wilderness. For days, they traveled, the landscape slowly changing around them. The harsh, rocky canyons gave way to rolling, verdant hills. The pines grew taller, the grass grew thicker. The air felt softer, cleaner. It was a land of promise, a land without memories. One evening, as the sun was setting, they crested a low rise and looked down into a wide, sheltered valley. A broad meadow of rich, green grass spread out before them, bisected by the sparkling creek. On one side of the meadow, a gentle knoll rose, dotted with ancient, broad-limbed oaks. It commanded a view of the entire valley, its back protected by a high, wooded ridge. Hannah stopped. She stared at the knoll, her expression unreadable. She had been searching for a place like this her whole life, first with Thomas and then, in her dreams, a place that felt safe, a place that felt like home. There, she said, her voice quiet, pointing. On that hill, overlooking the meadow. She looked at Ron, a question and a vulnerability in her eyes she could no longer hide. I'm not sure, but I am so tired of running. Ron looked at the spot she indicated. He saw what she saw. The good water, the plentiful grass, the way the hill caught the morning sun. He saw the way the trees would shelter a house from the winter winds. He saw a place where a life could be built. He turned and looked at her, at the weary hope in her face. Then let's be sure, he said. The two simple words were a vow, a promise more binding than any legal document. Yes, she whispered, a smile finally breaking through her exhaustion. Let's be sure. They left the horses to graze in the lush meadow and walked up the gentle slope of the knoll. The earth felt soft and rich beneath their boots. When they reached the spot, a natural clearing among the oaks, they stopped. Ron took a hand axe from his belt. He found a straight, thick branch and cut 4 lengths from it, sharpening one end of each to a point. He handed 2 to Hannah. He paced off the length of a wall, his long strides sure and even. Here, he said, and drove the first stake into the ground with the back of his axe. He paced off the width. Here. He drove in the second. Together. They measured and marked the other 2 corners, creating a perfect rectangle on the untouched earth. 4 simple wooden stakes, outlining a house that did not yet exist. They stood back and looked at their work. The wind, coming down from the high peaks, rustled the leaves in the oaks above them, But it was not the lonely, threatening wind of the high canyons. This wind carried the scent of rich soil and sweet grass, of wildflowers and clean water. It was the smell of a new beginning. It felt less like a threat and more like a promise. There, on that quiet hill, as the last light of day painted the sky in shades of rose and gold, a house was built. It had no walls, no roof, no floor. But in their minds, it was already complete. A front porch faced the setting sun. A stone chimney stood ready for a winter fire. An unwritten deed, held in a shared glance and confirmed by 4 wooden stakes, had just been filed in the heart of the wild, forgiving land. The days that followed were forged in the rhythm of sweat and sawdust. Life was pared down to its essentials: the rising of the sun, the heft of an axe, the satisfying thud of a well-placed hammer blow, and the setting of the sun. They were not building a cabin, they were building a life, one notched log at a time. Ron was the raw strength, his broad back and tireless arms felling the pines on the ridge behind the knoll. The sharp, clean scent of pine sap and freshly cut wood became the perfume of their new world. Hannah was the mind and the measure, her keen eye ensuring every line was true, every joint was flush. She would hold one end of a chalk line, he the other, and the snap of it against the pale wood was a sound of creation, a line drawn against the wilderness, claiming this small piece as their own. They discovered a new kind of conversation, one spoken in the language of work. A nod from her meant a log was a fraction too long. A grunt from him meant a joint was fitting perfectly. They moved around each other in an easy, practiced dance, their separate efforts weaving together into a single, purposeful motion. But the harmony was not without its moments of discord. Small, playful arguments that were as essential to the construction as the nails themselves. The most protracted of these was the great porch debate. "It must face east," Hannah declared one morning, holding a measuring rope and squinting into the rising sun. "To see the dawn, a porch should be for coffee and new beginnings." Ron, pausing with his adze half lifted, shook his head. "The creek is to the south," he countered, his voice reasonable but firm. "The sound of the water is a better thing to listen to than the sun yelling in your eyes. A porch is for the end of the day, for rest." "Rest," she scoffed, putting her hands on her hips. "Rest is for when you're dead. Mornings are for living. I want to see the light come over those hills. And I want to hear the water when the world goes quiet," he replied, his stubbornness a match for her own. They argued the point for 2 days, a gentle, recurring battle of sun versus water, of new beginnings versus quiet endings. The resolution, when it came, was so simple it made them both laugh. As they stood on the half-finished floor, the frame of the house rising around them. Ron looked from the east-facing front to the south-facing side. "Why does it have to be either or?" he asked. "We'll build it so it wraps the corner. You can have your sunrise, and I can have my creek. The house can have both." And so it was decided. The porch would be a bridge between their two natures, a testament not to compromise, but to a kind of wholeness neither had ever known alone. Their days found a rhythm as steady as a heartbeat. Hannah would rise in the pale, pre-dawn light, her movements quiet as she coaxed the fire to life. The smell of coffee and frying bacon would be the first thing to greet the new day. She was the dawn. As the sun set, casting long, golden shadows across the valley, she would sit by the firelight, a needle and thread in her hands, mending a tear in his shirt or patching a worn spot on her own dress. The small, rhythmic pull of the thread was a sound of quiet restoration. She was the dusk. One evening, she sat mending a particularly stubborn rip in his sleeve, her brow furrowed in concentration. The work was hard. Her muscles ached from a day of lifting and fitting logs, but a deep, unfamiliar sense of peace had settled in her heart. She sighed, a sound of weary contentment. "I suppose this will be my life now," she said softly, more to herself than to him. "I'll cook at dawn, and I'll sew at dusk." Ron, who had been oiling the handle of his axe by the fire,
grew still. He watched her, the firelight catching the stray wisps of her hair, turning them to spun gold. He saw the fine lines of fatigue around her eyes, but he also saw the quiet strength in the set of her mouth. She was like a willow, bent by the storms of her life but not broken, now putting down new roots in this rich soil. A wave of feeling, fierce and protective and overwhelmingly tender, rose in his chest. "And I'll love all day," he said. The words were spoken so quietly they were almost lost in the crackle of the fire. They were not a grand declaration, not a flowery promise. They were a simple statement of fact, as solid and unadorned as the log walls rising around them. Hannah's needle stopped mid-stitch. She slowly lifted her head, her eyes wide, and looked at him. In his gaze, she saw no doubt, no hesitation. She saw a truth as clear and deep as the water in their creek. The words hung in the air between them, a vow more sacred than any she had ever heard in a church. The wind, whispering through the unfinished window frames, seemed to catch the phrase, to carry it out into the vast, starry night, and then bring it back, to settle it forever in the warm, safe heart of the home they were building. She said nothing. She didn't need to. She simply picked up her needle, and with a hand that was perfectly steady, she finished the stitch. The nights continued in this new, comfortable harmony. After their meal, Ron would sometimes take down the small drum he had brought with them. He would tap out a slow, quiet rhythm, the deep, resonant thump-thump, a calming presence in the darkness, a heartbeat for their fledgling home. Hannah would take out the one book she owned, a tattered copy of Shakespeare, and read by the flickering light, her lips moving silently. The soft rustle of the turning pages and the steady beat of the drum became the two threads of their evening song. Two different melodies that, woven together, created a perfect, peaceful whole, like a strong, neat stitch finally closing a long, festering tear. Marshal Boone had sent along the horse he had recovered from one of Burke's men, a tall, beautiful gray gelding with intelligent eyes and a wary disposition. The horse, which Hannah named Ghost, was skittish and proud, shying away from Ron's touch. But with Hannah, it was different. She would speak to it in a low, soothing voice, and the horse would lower its head, allowing her to brush its coat until it shone like silver in the moonlight. Ron watched them one evening from the doorway, a wry smile on his face. Picky about who he trusts, he observed, leaning against the door frame. Stubborn, doesn't like to be told what to do, but gentle with the right touch. He paused, his eyes twinkling. I know a person just like that. Hannah looked up from the horse and threw a mock glare at him, but her cheeks were warm with a pleased blush. A month after they had begun building, a rider appeared on the horizon. It was one of Marshal Boone's deputies, a young man with a serious face. He carried a heavy canvas mail pouch. He handed Hannah a thick, folded envelope, sealed with a wax stamp. For a moment, cold fear seized her. An official-looking document could only mean trouble. The deputy tipped his hat and rode away, leaving them alone with the letter. Her hands trembled as she broke the seal. Inside were two documents. One was a letter from Marshal Boone, written in his surprisingly neat hand. He wrote that her ranch had sold for a fair price, and that he had enclosed a bank draft for the amount, minus a small fee for the Reverend's trouble. The second document was a deed, a formal, legal land title from the territorial office. She scanned the dense, legal script, her eyes searching for the name of the owner, and then she found it. The property, described by its markers of river, ridge, and ancient oak, was registered not to Hannah Reeves, not to Ron Hale. It was registered to Hannah Reeves and Ron Hale. The paper shook in her hand. A sound, a small gasp, escaped her lips. She looked up at Ron, her eyes shining with unshed tears. She couldn't speak. She just held the deed out to him. He took it, his brow furrowed in confusion. He was a man who could read the story of a forest in a single footprint,
but the formal language of the law was foreign to him. He read it slowly, his finger tracing the words. He stopped at their names, printed there side by side, bound together in black ink. He looked at the paper for a long time, as if trying to understand the weight and meaning of those words. Then he looked around him, at the half-finished walls, at the solid roof beams, at the smoke rising from their chimney. He looked at her, at the hopeful, trembling smile on her face. "So," he said, the words spoken slowly, as if he were tasting it for the first time. "It's a home." The next morning, in an attempt at celebration, Ron insisted on making the coffee. The result was a thick, bitter sludge that was an insult to both the bean and the water. Hannah took one sip and coughed, her eyes watering. She looked at him, at his proud, expectant face, and she laughed, a full, joyous sound that echoed in the morning air. "All right, you," she said, taking the pot from him. "You've proven your point. You're a fine builder, a brave fighter, and an adequate horse whisperer, but you are a menace to the morning." She smiled, her eyes full of a teasing, loving light. "You let me handle the dawn. You can learn to love the afternoon." That evening, they sat on the edge of their unfinished porch, their legs dangling, watching the sun dip below the western peaks. The valley was bathed in a light the color of warm honey. The house stood behind them, solid and real, its wooden walls glowing. In the distance, from the deep shadows near the creek, came a single, clear, yipping cry, a coyote, singing its evening song. It was not the lonesome, mournful sound of the high canyons. This call was different. It felt like an acknowledgement, a final, wild blessing, a nod of congratulations from the land itself, welcoming them home. The house was finished. The last wooden peg had been driven, the last roof shake laid. It stood on its knoll not like a scar on the landscape, but like something that had grown there, a natural outgrowth of the earth, smelling of fresh-cut pine and the rich, dark soil it was built upon. It was a home born not of dreams, but of necessity, of calloused hands and a shared, unspoken determination to build a wall against the ghosts of the past. One evening, after the work was done, Hannah found Ron not by the main fire, but by a small, intensely hot fire he had built in a ring of stones a short distance from the house. He was hunched over something, his focus absolute. In one hand, he held a pair of tongs, and in the tongs, glowing a dull, angry red in the twilight, was a small piece of metal. He was hammering it against a flat stone, the sharp, rhythmic tink, tink, tink of metal on metal, a strange, new music in the quiet valley. She drew closer and saw what he was working with. It was the brass casing of a spent rifle cartridge. She didn't know if it was from the fight with Burke or from some other, older battle. And she knew it didn't matter. It was a remnant of the violence that had thrown them together, a small, ugly piece of their shared history. He would heat it in the coals until it was pliable, then draw it out, hammering it carefully, patiently, bending the metal of death into a circle of life. He worked for hours, his face illuminated by the glow of the fire, the sweat beading on his brow. He was not just shaping metal. He was performing an alchemical act, forging a future from the very material of their violent past. When he was finally finished, he quenched the small, misshapen circle in a cup of water, the hiss of steam a final, sighing breath. He polished it with a piece of soft leather, rubbing away the soot and grime until the brass shone with a soft, warm light, like a captured piece of the sunset. He came to her as she stood on their new porch, looking out at the first stars pricking the deep velvet of the sky. He didn't kneel. He didn't make a grand speech. Such things were not his language. He simply stood before her in the gathering dark and held out his hand. Lying in his palm was the small, imperfect ring. It was not a thing of beauty by any jeweler's standard. It was slightly uneven, marked by the hammer, but it was solid, whole, and warm from his hand.
He looked into her eyes, and his voice, when he spoke, was as low and steady as the beat of his drum. "The flood took everything once," he said, and the words were a confession and a vow. He was laying the deepest wound of his life at her feet. "If the river rises again, if the fire comes, if this house is swept away, we will build again, from the ashes." It was the promise of a man who knew the world could be cruel and capricious, a man who knew that nothing was permanent. His vow was not of forever, but of resilience, of endurance, of a refusal to be broken. Tears welled in Hannah's eyes, but they did not fall. She looked at the ring, then back at his face, at the quiet strength she had come to depend on more than the solid earth beneath her feet. She had come to his cabin seeking refuge, a temporary port in a storm. She had not expected to find a harbor. "I already stayed," she whispered, her voice thick with an emotion she could not name. "Now I'll stay some more." It was her own vow, as simple and as profound as his, a choice made not in the heat of passion, but in the quiet, steady light of a shared dawn. He took her left hand in his. He slid the ring onto her fourth finger. It was a snug fit, passing over the knuckle and settling at the base. It was a circle of warm brass against a finger marked by the calluses of a woman who knew the heft of a hammer, the grip of a horse's reins, the work of building a life with her own two hands. It belonged there. She lifted her other hand and gently touched his cheek, her thumb tracing the line of his jaw. Then she leaned in, resting her forehead against his. They stood like that for a long moment, two people breathing the same air, their shared past and their uncertain future held in the small, sacred space between them. "You smell of smoke," she murmured, her eyes closed. "You smell of horses," he replied, his voice a low rumble in his chest. A small smile touched her lips. "Then we're even." The next morning, the sun rose on a world that was both the same and entirely new. The dawn chorus of the birds was the same. The gentle gurgle of the creek was the same. But inside the house, everything was different. Hannah moved through the familiar rituals of the morning, but they were imbued with a new weight, a new meaning. She scooped flour from the bin to make biscuits, the soft white powder clinging to her fingers. The ring on her hand, a small, constant reminder of the promise she had made. She set the coffee pot on the stove, the rich, dark aroma filling the warm kitchen. She took up his shirt from the night before, the one with the torn sleeve, and with her needle and thread. She began to close the gap, her stitches small and neat, a quiet act of mending, of making whole. He stepped in from the yard, bringing the cool morning air with him. His hands were covered in fine wood shavings. He had been carving a new latch for the gate. He stopped in the doorway, and for a moment, he just watched her. He watched the way the early morning light fell across her face as she bent over her sewing. He watched the deft, sure movements of her hands. He saw not just a woman, but the entire shape of his future. The loneliness that had been his constant companion for so long, a shadow that had followed him from the banks of the San Pedro to these high, lonely mountains, was gone. It had been replaced by this quiet woman, by the smell of baking bread, by the sight of a needle and thread making something broken new again. He walked into the kitchen, his boots silent on the wooden floor. He stood before her. She looked up, a question in her eyes. He reached out and gently took the sewing from her hands. Setting it aside, he took her hands in his, the ones that smelled of flour and soap, and held them. He spoke slowly, his voice rough with an emotion he did not try to hide. He was reciting the litany of their life, the rhythm they had created together, the words she herself had spoken. "You cook at dawn," he said, his gaze holding hers. "You sow at dusk." He paused, and his thumbs gently stroked the backs of her hands. "The rest of the day is for me to love you." From the corner of the room, where his small drum sat on its peg, there came a single, soft, resonant thump. It was not a sound made by a human hand. It was the house itself, settling on its foundation, the wood contracting in the morning cool.
A single heartbeat, deep and final. And then it was silent, leaving only the sound of their two breaths, rising and falling in perfect, unspoken unison. Outside, the sun climbed higher, streaming through the kitchen window. A ray of light caught the silver locket that still hung around Hannah's neck. It fell upon the smooth, empty surface where a portrait had once been. But the locket was not empty now. In its polished, silver face, two small, indistinct figures were reflected, standing close together in the warm light of their new home, from far down in the valley. A coyote called, a single, sharp bark that was not a cry of loneliness, but an answer. The smoke from their chimney rose straight and true into the clear blue sky, a single, unwavering thread stitching their small, new life to the vast, open canvas of the world. Thank you so much for listening to our story. If you enjoyed it, please let us know where in the world you're listening from in the comments below. We'd love to share this experience with you. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel, Wild West Stories 1850, and give this video a like. And if you'd like to help this story reach more people, please consider hitting the hype button to give it an extra boost. We appreciate your support more than words can say.